The dusty military transport truck rolled to a stop outside the small white house on Maple Street. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez stepped down from the vehicle, his desert combat boots hitting the familiar pavement of his hometown for the first time in 18 months. The hot Texas sun beat down on his shoulders as he shouldered his heavy duffel bag, but nothing could dampen the excitement coursing through his veins. He was finally home. The deployment in Afghanistan had been brutal. Long nights patrolling dangerous roads, the constant threat of improvised explosive devices, and the loss of two good friends had taken their toll on the 28-year-old Marine. But through it all, one thing had kept him going: the thought of returning to his wife Sarah and their 3 dogs, Max, a German shepherd he had rescued as a puppy, Bella, a golden retriever mix they had adopted from the shelter, and Rocky, an old pit bull who had been with them since before their marriage. As Mike walked up the cracked sidewalk toward his house, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. There, huddled together on the front porch, were his 3 beloved dogs. But something was terribly wrong. All 3 animals were shaking violently, their tails tucked between their legs, eyes wide with what looked like pure terror. Max, usually the brave protector of the family, was pressed against the front door as if trying to hide. Bella whimpered softly, a sound Mike had never heard from the normally cheerful dog. Rocky, despite his tough appearance, was trembling like a leaf in a storm. Mike dropped his duffel bag on the walkway and approached slowly. The dogs recognized him immediately, but instead of the joyful reunion he had imagined countless times during lonely nights overseas, they seemed almost relieved to see him, as if he were their salvation. Max crawled toward him on his belly, still shaking while Bella pressed herself against his legs. Rocky remained by the door, whining in a way that sent chills down Mike's spine. Something was very, very wrong. Mike's military training kicked in as he surveyed the scene. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, newspapers were scattered on the porch, and the windows were dark. His wife's car was nowhere to be seen. But most disturbing of all was the behavior of his dogs. These were animals he had raised and trained, dogs who were confident and happy. The terrified creatures before him were almost unrecognizable. Mike knelt down and gently stroked Max's head, feeling the dog's rapid heartbeat through his fur. The German shepherd looked up at him with eyes that seemed to plead for help, for protection, for someone to make everything right again. Bella nuzzled closer, seeking comfort, while Rocky finally approached, moving slowly as if every step required tremendous courage. The Marine's hand shook as he reached for his house key, though he couldn't tell if it was from anticipation, exhaustion from the long journey home, or a growing sense of dread. The dog's behavior was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. They acted like animals who had been traumatized, who had seen or experienced something that had shattered their sense of security. As he inserted the key into the lock, Mike noticed that his dogs positioned themselves behind him, as if they were afraid of what lay beyond that door but trusted him to protect them from it. The key turned with a familiar click, but as Mike pushed the door open, the dogs pressed closer to him, their trembling intensifying. Whatever had happened in his absence, whatever had reduced his brave, loyal companions to this state of terror, he was about to discover it. The house that should have been filled with warmth and welcome felt cold and ominous. Mike took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he might find inside, knowing that his life was about to change forever. The front door creaked open, revealing a hallway that Mike barely recognized. The cheerful yellow walls that Sarah had painted just before his deployment were now bare and marked with strange scratches and holes. The family photos that had lined the entrance were gone, leaving only faded rectangles on the paint where they once hung. A musty smell filled the air, mixed with something else that made Mike's stomach turn. The dogs refused to enter the house, clustering around his legs as he stepped inside. Mike called out, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. "Sarah, Sarah, are you home?" But only silence answered him. The living room was completely empty except for a few pieces of furniture that had been turned over and left in disarray. The couch where he and Sarah used to watch movies was flipped upside down, its cushions scattered across the floor. As Mike moved deeper into the house, the dogs following reluctantly behind him, he noticed more disturbing details. The kitchen cabinets were all open, their contents either missing or strewn across the counters and floor. Broken dishes crunched under his boots, and the refrigerator door hung open, revealing nothing but empty shelves and a strong odor of spoiled food. A layer of dust covered everything, suggesting the house had been abandoned for weeks, maybe months. In the bedroom he had shared with his wife, Mike found evidence of a hasty departure. Dresser drawers were pulled out and empty. The closet door stood open, revealing only a few wire hangers swaying in the stale air. Their wedding photo, which had always sat on Sarah's nightstand, was gone. The only thing remaining was a thin layer of dust where it had been, and a small piece of broken glass that caught the afternoon light streaming through the dirty windows. But it was in the basement where Mike discovered something that made his blood run cold. The dogs absolutely refused to go down the wooden steps, whimpering and backing away when he approached the basement door. Max even tried to grab Mike's sleeve with his teeth, as if trying to prevent him from descending into whatever horror lay below. Mike flicked on the basement light, though it took several tries before the old bulb finally flickered to life. What he saw made him understand why his dogs were so terrified. The basement had been turned into some kind of makeshift laboratory or workshop. Tables lined the walls, covered with strange equipment Mike didn't recognize. Glass containers filled with unknown liquids sat on metal shelves, and the concrete floor was stained with dark patches that looked disturbingly like dried blood. But what truly shocked him were the cages. At least a dozen wire kennels of various sizes were stacked along one wall, all empty now but bearing signs of recent use. Food and water bowls were scattered around, some still containing moldy remnants of kibble. The smell down there was overwhelming, a mixture of chemicals, animal waste, and something else that made Mike's eyes water. On a workbench near the back of the basement, Mike found a notebook filled with handwriting he didn't recognize. The pages contained detailed notes about different dog breeds, their temperaments, their market values, and shipping schedules to various locations. Phone numbers were scrawled in the margins alongside names and addresses from several different states. As Mike flipped through the pages, a horrible picture began to emerge. His house had been used as some kind of illegal operation involving dogs. The evidence suggested that someone had been using his property to run a puppy mill, or perhaps something even worse, a dog fighting operation or illegal breeding facility. The thought that his own home had been turned into a place of suffering for innocent animals made Mike's hands shake with rage. But the most devastating realization was yet to come. On the last page of the notebook, in handwriting he now recognized as Sarah's, was a list of dates and dollar amounts. Next to the final entry, dated just 2 weeks ago, were the words "final cleanup complete" and "dogs relocated." His wife hadn't been a victim of this operation. She had been running it. Mike collapsed into the single remaining chair in what used to be his kitchen, the notebook still clutched in his trembling hands. The 3 dogs had finally ventured inside but stayed close to the back door, as if ready to bolt at any moment. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound he had sustained in combat. While he had been fighting for his country, risking his life in a desert thousands of miles away, his wife had been using their home as a base for illegal activities that caused suffering to countless innocent animals. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with sickening clarity. The extra money Sarah had mentioned in her letters, money she claimed came from a new job at a local business. The way she had started discouraging him from calling home at certain times, saying she was working odd hours, the gradual decrease in her communication over the past 6 months of his deployment. Even the dog's current condition made horrible sense now. Max, Bella, and Rocky had witnessed whatever operations had taken place in their home. They had seen other dogs come and go, had heard sounds of distress, had lived in an environment of fear and uncertainty. Mike's phone rang, startling him from his dark thoughts. The caller ID showed his mother's number. With shaking fingers, he answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mike, honey, are you home safe?" His mother's warm voice filled the quiet house. "Yeah, Mom, I'm home," he managed to say, though the word home felt foreign and bitter on his tongue. "Is everything okay? You sound strange. Where's Sarah? I tried calling her last week to plan a welcome home party for you, but her phone was disconnected." Mike closed his eyes, fighting back the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "Mom, when was the last time you actually talked to Sarah? I mean, really talked to her?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well, now that you mention it, it's been quite a while. Maybe 3 or 4 months ago. She said she was very busy with work and couldn't chat. I thought it was odd, but you know how independent she always was. 3 or 4 months. That timeline matched with what Mike was discovering." His mother continued. "Actually, Mrs. Henderson next door called me a few weeks ago. She was concerned because she hadn't seen Sarah in a while, and there had been a lot of strange activity at your house. Cars coming and going at all hours, barking dogs that weren't yours, men loading cages into trucks. I told her it must be some kind of misunderstanding. Mike felt his heart sink even further. What kind of men, Mom? Did Mrs. Henderson describe them? She said they looked rough, like the kind of people you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley. One had tattoos covering his arms, and they all drove these big, expensive trucks. She was so worried she almost called the police a couple of times. But Sarah had told her they were just friends helping with some kind of business project. After hanging up with his mother, Mike walked over to his dogs, who were still huddled together by the back door. As he knelt down to comfort them, he noticed something he had missed before. All 3 dogs had small scars on their legs and necks, the kind that came from rough handling or being kept in cramped conditions. Bella's beautiful golden coat was dull and patchy in places, and Rocky had a thin scar across his snout that definitely hadn't been there when Mike left for deployment. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His own dogs hadn't just been witnesses to the illegal operation, they had been victims of it. They had been mistreated, possibly used as breeding stock or worse. The trembling, the fear, the way they stayed close to doors as if ready to escape. These were the behaviors of animals who had been traumatized and abused. Mike gathered all 3 dogs into his arms, feeling their rapid heartbeats against his chest. "I'm so sorry," he whispered into Max's fur. "I should have been here to protect you. I should have known something was wrong." As if understanding his words, Max licked his face gently, and for the first time since Mike had arrived home, the dog's tail gave a tentative wag. Bella pressed closer, seeking comfort, while Rocky rested his head on Mike's shoulder with a deep, shuddering sigh. But even as Mike tried to comfort his traumatized pets, his mind was racing with questions. Where was Sarah now? How long had this been going on? What had happened to all the other dogs who had passed through his house? And most importantly, what was he going to do about it? The next morning, Mike sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and Sarah's notebook, trying to decode the cryptic entries. The dogs had spent the night pressed against him on the living room floor, unwilling to let him out of their sight. Every few hours, one of them would whimper or cry out in their sleep, caught in nightmares that Mike could only imagine. As he studied the notebook more carefully, Mike began to understand the scope of what had been happening. The operation had been sophisticated and well organized. There were references to suppliers in different states who provided dogs, processors who handled medical procedures, and distributors who moved the animals to their final destinations. The amounts of money involved were staggering, thousands of dollars per shipment, with Sarah's cut clearly documented in her careful handwriting. A knock at the door interrupted his investigation. Mike opened it to find Mrs. Henderson, his elderly neighbor, holding a plate of homemade cookies. Her kind face immediately creased with concern when she saw his haggard appearance. "Oh, Mike dear, I heard you were back. I'm so glad you're safe." She paused, looking past him into the empty house. "Where's Sarah? And what happened to your furniture?" Mike invited Mrs. Henderson inside and gently questioned her about what she had witnessed. The elderly woman's account painted an even darker picture than Mike had imagined. She described seeing dozens of dogs over the past year, many of them in poor condition, being moved in and out of his house at all hours. She had noticed that some dogs arrived healthy but left looking sick and weak. Others came in injured and left in wooden crates that she suspected contained something other than living animals. "I wanted to call the police so many times," Mrs. Henderson said, wringing her hands. "But Sarah always had an explanation. She said you had asked her to help a friend with a dog rescue operation while you were deployed. She was so convincing, and I didn't want to cause trouble for a military family." Mrs. Henderson also revealed that she had seen Sarah loading suitcases into her car late one night about 3 weeks ago. She looked frantic, constantly checking her phone and glancing around like she was afraid someone might see her. The next morning she was gone, and I haven't seen her since. After Mrs. Henderson left, Mike called the base and requested extended leave to deal with family matters. His commanding officer, hearing the strain in his voice, immediately approved the request and offered additional resources if needed. Mike then made the hardest phone call of his life, to the local police department. Detective Lisa Chen arrived that afternoon with a team of investigators. Mike showed her through the house and basement, explaining what he had found and sharing Sarah's notebook. Detective Chen's expression grew more serious with each piece of evidence. Mr. Rodriguez, what you're describing sounds like a large-scale puppy mill operation, possibly connected to dogfighting rings, she explained. The cages, the medical equipment, the shipping schedules, this all fits a pattern we've been tracking across several states. The detective explained that they had been investigating a network of illegal dog operations for over 2 years. Several raids in neighboring states had turned up evidence pointing to a hub somewhere in their area, but they had never been able to pinpoint the location. Mike's house appeared to be the missing piece of their puzzle. The good news is that if we can build a solid case, we might be able to shut down this entire network, Detective Chen said. The bad news is that your wife is likely facing serious federal charges. Animal cruelty, racketeering, tax evasion, and possibly more depending on what else we uncover. As the investigation team worked through the house, collecting evidence and taking photographs, Mike sat on his front porch with his 3 dogs. Max had barely left his side all day, as if the German Shepherd understood that his human was suffering too. Bella kept bringing Mike her favorite tennis ball, perhaps trying to cheer him up with the only comfort she knew how to offer. Rocky, despite his own trauma, positioned himself protectively between Mike and the strangers working in the house. The evidence collection took hours. Investigators found hidden cameras that had recorded activities in the basement, financial records hidden in the walls, and communications equipment that had been used to coordinate with other locations. They also discovered a hidden room behind the water heater where the most disturbing evidence was stored. Medical supplies that suggested amateur surgical procedures had been performed on animals, and documentation of illegal breeding programs designed to produce fighting dogs. Detective Chen approached Mike as her team finished their work. We found enough evidence here to issue warrants for at least 15 people, including your wife. This was the center of a major criminal operation, Mr. Rodriguez. I'm sorry you had to come home to this. Mike nodded, feeling numb. What happens now? Now we begin the process of bringing these people to justice, and we try to find and help as many of their victims as possible, both the animals who were harmed and the people who were deceived. She looked at Max, Bella, and Rocky with sadness in her eyes. Your dogs are survivors, Mr. Rodriguez. They've been through hell, but they're still here and they're still loyal to you. That says something about both their strength and yours. 3 weeks after the initial discovery, Mike found himself sitting in the office of Dr. Amanda Foster, a veterinarian who specialized in treating animals rescued from abuse situations. Max, Bella, and Rocky were all undergoing comprehensive medical examinations to document their injuries and begin their healing process. Dr. Foster's findings were heartbreaking, but not unexpected. All 3 dogs showed signs of prolonged stress and malnutrition. Max had several small scars from what appeared to be rough handling and confinement in spaces too small for his large frame. Bella's reproductive system showed evidence of forced breeding, explaining her previous pregnancies that Mike had never known about. Rocky bore the most visible scars, including evidence of being used as a bait dog to train fighting animals, a practice that involved allowing aggressive dogs to attack him while he was restrained. The remarkable thing, Dr. Foster explained as she completed her examination of Rocky, is their resilience. Despite everything they've been through, these dogs haven't lost their capacity for trust and affection. That's largely because they had a strong foundation of love and security with you before this happened. The veterinarian's words provided some comfort, but Mike still struggled with guilt. How had he not known what was happening in his own home? Why hadn't he asked more questions when Sarah's letters became less frequent? The self-doubt aided him constantly, especially during the long nights when one or all of his dogs would wake up from nightmares, needing his comfort and reassurance. Detective Chen called regularly with updates on the investigation. The evidence from Mike's house had indeed been the key to cracking a multi-state criminal network. Raids had been conducted in 7 states, resulting in the rescue of over 300 dogs and the arrest of 24 people. The operation had been even larger than initially suspected, involving not just puppy mills and dogfighting, but also the sale of stolen pets and the trafficking of rare and exotic dog breeds. Sarah remained at large, though her photograph was now on wanted posters across the country. Security footage from various locations showed her fleeing the state just days before Mike's return, apparently tipped off by someone within the organization that law enforcement was closing. In the financial investigation revealed, that Sarah had accumulated over $400,000 from her illegal activities, money that was hidden in offshore accounts. She had been planning her escape for months, systematically emptying their joint accounts and selling everything of value from their home. The house itself was heavily mortgaged, despite being nearly paid off when Mike deployed, with Sarah having taken out multiple loans against the property to fund the criminal operation. Mike's life fell into a new routine, centered entirely around caring for his traumatized dogs. He woke up early each morning to take them on gentle walks, gradually working to rebuild their confidence. Max still jumped at unexpected sounds, but he was slowly learning to trust his surroundings again. Bella had started playing with toys, though she remained anxious when separated from Mike for even short periods. Rocky's progress was the most dramatic. The tough pit bull who had arrived home trembling with fear was beginning to show glimpses of his old protective personality. The community response to Mike's story was overwhelming. When local news outlets covered the investigation, donations poured in from across the country. Pet supply companies sent food, toys, and bedding for the rescued dogs. Veterinarians offered free services. Volunteers showed up at Mike's door offering to help with dog walking, yard work, and home repairs. But perhaps the most meaningful support came from other military families who had faced similar betrayals. Mike received letters and emails from dozens of service members whose spouses had engaged in illegal activities while they were deployed. Some had come home to find their homes foreclosed, their bank accounts empty, or their families destroyed by addiction or infidelity. These shared experiences helped Mike understand that he wasn't alone and that the betrayal he felt wasn't a reflection of his own failures. One evening, as Mike sat on his newly donated couch with all 3 dogs pressed against him, he received a call that changed everything. It was Agent Martinez from the FBI's Animal Crimes Task Force. "Mr. Rodriguez, we've located your wife. She was arrested this morning trying to cross the border into Mexico with false identification documents. She's been charged with federal racketeering, animal cruelty, money laundering, and several other crimes. But here's the thing, she wants to make a deal." Mike's heart pounded as Agent Martinez explained that Sarah was offering to provide information about other criminal networks in exchange for a reduced sentence. She claimed to have detailed knowledge of operations in at least 12 states and was willing to testify against the people who had recruited her into the business. The decision about whether to support a plea agreement is ultimately up to the prosecutors, Agent Martinez continued, but they'd like to know how you feel about it. Your wife's cooperation could help us save hundreds more animals and put some very dangerous people behind bars. Mike looked down at Rocky, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time since Mike had come home, his head resting trustingly on Mike's lap. The decision should have been easy. Justice demanded that Sarah face the full consequences of her actions. But the possibility of preventing other animals from suffering the way his dogs had suffered complicated his feelings about revenge versus redemption. Mike spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the decision about Sarah's plea deal. Every time he looked at his dogs and saw their scars, both physical and emotional, anger flared in his chest. But when he thought about all the other animals still suffering in similar operations across the country, he knew what he had to do. He called Agent Martinez and gave his support for the plea agreement. With one condition, he wanted to be present when Sarah provided her testimony. He needed to hear directly from her why she had done this, how she had been able to look at Max, Bella, and Rocky every day while allowing other dogs to be tortured and killed in their home. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room at the federal building. Mike arrived early, his stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and dread. When Sarah was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, he barely recognized the woman he had married 6 years earlier. She had lost weight, her hair was unkempt, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights filled with guilt or fear. Sarah's eyes filled with tears when she saw him, but Mike's expression remained stoic. She began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, explaining how the illegal operation had started small. A friend had approached her about making easy money by housing dogs temporarily. What began as keeping 2 or 3 animals for a few days had gradually escalated into a full-scale criminal enterprise. "I told myself I was just providing temporary shelter," Sarah said, unable to meet Mike's eyes. "But the money was so good and they kept asking for more space, more services. Before I knew it, I was in too deep to get out. She described how the criminal organization had used intimidation and threats to keep her compliant once she tried to back out. They had photographs of her participating in the operation and had threatened to frame Mike as being involved when he returned from deployment. The fear of ruining his military career had paralyzed her, making her feel trapped in an increasingly dangerous situation. "But that doesn't excuse what I did to our dogs," Sarah continued, finally looking at Mike with genuine remorse in her eyes. "Max, Bella, and Rocky were supposed to be off limits, but toward the end, when the organization was desperate for breeding stock, they forced me to use them too. I tried to protect them as much as I could, but..." Mike's hands clenched into fists under the table. The thought of his loyal dogs being used as breeding machines while their owner watched helplessly filled him with rage he struggled to contain. Sarah's information proved invaluable to law enforcement. Over the following months, her testimony led to raids that rescued over 800 animals and resulted in convictions for 37 individuals involved in the network. The operation had been even more extensive than investigators had imagined, with connections to illegal gambling, drug trafficking, and weapons sales. As part of her plea agreement, Sarah received a sentence of 8 years in federal prison, significantly less than the 25 years she could have faced. The judge noted her cooperation with law enforcement, but emphasized that her crimes had caused immeasurable suffering to innocent animals and betrayed the trust of a service member serving his country overseas. Mike attended the sentencing hearing, not to support Sarah, but to ensure that the victims of her crimes were represented. He had prepared a victim impact statement describing how the betrayal had affected not just him, but his 3 dogs, who continued to struggle with trauma months after their rescue. "These animals cannot speak for themselves," Mike told the court, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. "But their suffering is real, their trauma is ongoing, and their recovery will take years." The defendant chose money over morality, greed over loyalty, and personal gain over the welfare of innocent creatures who depended on her for protection. After the sentencing, Mike and his dogs began the slow process of rebuilding their lives. The house on Maple Street held too many painful memories, so Mike used the donated funds and money recovered from Sarah's criminal activity to purchase a small farm outside of town. The wide open spaces and peaceful environment provided the perfect setting for his dog's continued recovery. Max slowly regained his confidence, once again becoming the protective leader of the pack. His alertness remained heightened. He would always be watchful for potential threats, but he learned to relax and enjoy simple pleasures like chasing butterflies in the pasture and swimming in the pond. Bella's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. The golden retriever mix, who had arrived home traumatized and withdrawn, gradually rediscovered her love of play. She became obsessed with a rope toy that Mike had bought her, carrying it everywhere and using it to initiate games with her canine brothers. Her coat grew thick and shiny again, and her eyes regained their warm, trusting glow. Rocky's recovery took the longest, but his progress was steady. The pit bull, who had been used as a bait dog, slowly learned that not all interactions with other dogs would result in pain. Mike introduced him to carefully selected gentle dogs from the local animal shelter, supervised interactions that gradually rebuilt Rocky's social confidence. The scars on his snout would always be visible reminders of what he had endured, but they became badges of his survival rather than marks of victimization. 2 years after that devastating homecoming, Mike stood in the morning sunshine outside his farmhouse, watching his 3 dogs play in the expansive yard he had built for them. Max was teaching a lesson in pack leadership to the newest member of their family, a young rescue dog named Hope, who had been seized from another illegal breeding operation. Bella was engaged in her favorite game of fetch with a volunteer from the local animal sanctuary. Rocky lay contentedly in the shade, supervising the activities with the calm confidence of a dog who had found peace after trauma. The farm had become more than just a home for Mike and his dogs. It had evolved into Second Chance Ranch, a rehabilitation center for animals rescued from abuse situations. Mike had used his military leadership skills and the insurance settlement from his destroyed marriage to create a place where traumatized animals could heal alongside humans who understood their pain. The ranch housed up to 20 dogs at any given time, each one carefully matched with a volunteer handler who was also recovering from trauma. Many of his volunteers were fellow veterans dealing with PTSD, people who found that caring for wounded animals helped them process their own emotional injuries. Others were civilians who had survived various forms of betrayal or loss and discovered that the unconditional love of a rescued dog provided healing they couldn't find elsewhere. Dr. Foster had become a regular visitor to the ranch, providing medical care and behavioral assessment for the rescued animals. She often remarked that Mike's 3 dogs served as incredible ambassadors for recovery, showing newly arrived animals that it was possible to trust again, to play again, to find joy after suffering. What Max, Bella, and Rocky demonstrate every day, she told a group of veterinary students during a visit to the ranch, is that resilience isn't about forgetting trauma or pretending it didn't happen. It's about learning to live fully despite what you've experienced, and using that experience to help others who are struggling with similar challenges. Mike had also become an advocate for stronger laws protecting animals from abuse and exploitation. He testified before state legislature committees, spoke at law enforcement training seminars, and worked with federal agencies to improve investigation techniques for animal crimes. The notebook Sarah had left behind, with its detailed documentation of criminal operations, had become a training tool for investigators across the country. The success of Second Chance Ranch had attracted national attention. Media outlets featured stories about the Marine who had turned his personal tragedy into a mission of healing and hope. Donations arrived regularly from across the country, along with requests from other communities wanting to establish similar programs. But for Mike, the most meaningful moments weren't the public recognition or media attention. They were the quiet mornings when he sat on his porch with his morning coffee, surrounded by dogs who had learned to trust again. They were the afternoons when he watched a traumatized animal take its first tentative steps toward healing. They were the evenings when volunteers shared stories about how caring for rescued dogs had helped them process their own pain and find purpose in their lives. Max had become the unofficial greeter for new arrivals at the ranch, using his calm confidence to reassure frightened animals that they were safe. His gentle approach with traumatized dogs had earned him recognition as a therapy animal, and he regularly visited schools and community centers to educate children about responsible pet ownership and the importance of treating all creatures with kindness. Bella had discovered a talent for working with elderly dogs who had been abandoned or surrendered by their families. Her patient, nurturing personality made her the perfect companion for senior animals who needed extra care and comfort during their final years. She had been present for the peaceful passing of over a dozen elderly dogs, providing comfort and companionship to ensure that no animal died alone or afraid. Rocky had perhaps made the most dramatic transformation of all. The dog who had once cowered in terror at every sound had become a confident protector of the ranch's most vulnerable residents. He had an uncanny ability to identify which animals needed extra security and would position himself nearby, standing guard while they slept or ate. His presence seemed to communicate to other traumatized animals that someone strong and brave was watching over them. On this particular morning, as Mike watched his dogs interact with the latest group of rescues, he reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. The betrayal that had shattered his world had ultimately led to the creation of something beautiful and meaningful. The pain that had nearly broken him had been transformed into a source of healing for countless animals and people. He thought about Sarah sometimes, wondering if she had found any peace during her incarceration. Reports from the prison indicated that she had become involved in a program training service dogs for veterans with PTSD, perhaps finding her own path to redemption through service to animals. Mike didn't know if he would ever be able to forgive her completely, but he had learned that forgiveness was less about her and more about his own freedom from the bitterness that had once consumed him. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the farmhouse and pastures in golden light, Mike smiled as he watched Hope, the young rescue, finally work up the courage to approach Rocky. The old pit bull, scarred but wise, lowered his head and gently touched noses with the frightened puppy, welcoming her into the pack with the same patience and kindness that had helped him heal. In that moment, Mike understood that this was what recovery looked like. Not the absence of scars, but the transformation of pain into purpose, the conversion of betrayal into compassion, and the evolution of broken trust into a deeper capacity for love and protection. The Marine who had come home to find his world destroyed had become a guardian for the most vulnerable creatures in society. His 3 loyal dogs, who had trembled on that porch in terror 2 years ago, had become ambassadors of hope, living proof that even the deepest wounds could heal with time, patience, and unconditional love. As Mike called his dogs inside for breakfast, Max bounded over with his tail wagging, Bella trotted up with her rope toy still in her mouth, and Rocky approached with the steady confidence of a dog who knew he was home. They had all survived their darkest moments together, and together they had built something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal. The ranch would continue to grow, more animals would find healing, and more people would discover that sometimes the greatest purpose in life comes from the deepest pain. But for now, on this peaceful morning surrounded by his faithful companions, Mike Rodriguez was exactly where he belonged, home at last. Not just as a place on a map, but as a state of the heart, where broken things could become whole again. The 3 dogs who had once trembled in fear now ran freely across acres of green grass, their joy a testament to the resilience of the spirit and the healing power of love that never gives up, never surrenders, and never stops believing in second chances.